Okay, everybody, welcome back to Wise Wealth Podcast. I've got a very exciting guest with us today, James Kilpatrick. He's going to be giving himself an introduction to what he's doing. Super excited to get the conversation going. So let's jump straight in and I'll hand over to James.
Samuel, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. My name is James Kilpatrick. I currently run a small space business called Gravity Lab Aerospace Services, and we're based in the wilds of Norfolk in the east of England, and we've been going for about 4 years, but I've had a slightly circuitous journey to get here, having started my career working in financial services, working in investment management, and then through various roles in investment banking, before I decided to get much more involved in the venture capital world.
Amazing. So in regards to your background, you said investment management. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, what that was doing?
Yes, I'd studied accountancy at university, but I guess that's like learning the rules. It's a bit like I enjoy playing football, but I didn't want to become a referee. So having learnt the rules, if you like, as an accountant, I then trained as an investment manager, and I particularly focused back in the 1980s on investing in Japan and the Far East. There were quite exciting times in the market there, but probably had a little bit of a bit more interested in the transactional side of the business. So I then switched across to advising people on their investments in Japan and the Far East, and I worked with a number of big investment banks over a period of 15 years or so, which was tremendous fun, and the markets were very exciting in those days. But I also found myself investing my bonuses in startup companies that friends were starting up, and it got to a point where I found that the startup companies were actually more exciting than my day job. So I then, at the end of the 90s, I switched across to getting involved with small venture businesses, and I've been working in that arena for the last 25 years, I suppose.
Amazing. That sounds really, really interesting. I suppose quite a wide, very diverse background. So what got you to go from investments in the Far East to then going down towards Gravity Labs, completely different avenue, I suppose?
I think when I started some private investments, I was investing in things like restaurants, and had a success with some pizza restaurants, which we sold out, and so then we set up some Thai restaurants. I think we set up the second Thai restaurant in London back at the end of the 80s, and then I was getting into garden centres. We ended up. A friend of mine set up a business up in Scotland, and that went very well, and eventually he sold that to Tesco's, about 20 years later. And I guess that over a period of time, I got more and more involved in businesses that were part of really, really large markets, but the markets just were going through a dramatic growth phase at the time. So later on, I got into online media at the beginning of the 2000s. I got into some data businesses. I was a shareholder and a director of Opta, the sports data business from the early 2000s. I got into some fashion businesses and things, but it was a mixture, I suppose, of consumer-facing businesses and business to business, as they call it in the trade. The areas that never did very well for me were investing in the arts. So I invested in a theatre business, I've invested in an art gallery, I've invested in a film production company, and none of those worked out well for me. So I think, when it comes to art, just appreciate it, don't invest in it.
Yeah.
But no, so the business is good, and I guess that the most successful investments tended to be in really big industries that were going through a particular growth phase. And also I think that service businesses have worked out really well for me. Partly because you require less capital to get a service business going. It does become much more reliant on the people. But if you've got a smaller capital base, and things do work out well, then your return on capital ends up being much better. And I guess the other factor to take into account is that, particularly in the last 25 years, technology has had a really big role to play. And as technology has disrupted big industries that are growing fast. That's created a lot of investment opportunity, and most of the successful businesses I've been involved in, they've certainly had some sort of technology angle to them.
Okay. Very, very interesting. And can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing right now then with Gravity Labs?
Well, I had a business that I set up back at the early 2000s, which I sold in 2018, and felt that I wanted to sort of get back into the market and set up another business. And I went to a strange thing called the Norfolk Enterprise Festival, which was about 250 people wandering around in a muddy field and some tents in Norfolk, where the idea was some small businesses could showcase themselves and people could learn a bit about small investment world. And I came across a guy who wanted to build some rockets, and we got chatting, and it struck me that the space industry was really enormous. I think they variously assessed at around sort of $300-400 billion industry at the moment, and some people think it's going to be well over $1 trillion by the end of the decade. So that sort of struck me as being an industry that was large. I was well aware of lots of private capital flooding in, whether it's Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and these companies were really proving disruptive. The technology that was being developed also was changing things. So the legacy technology, particularly in terms of rockets, that was prevalent from the 1960s and 70s, that was being changed. And so a lot of those ingredients, if you like, were the same sort of ingredients that I'd found had been good for successful businesses in the past. So I got involved with this business, and I think my role was not to do any of the technical stuff. I wasn't a very good student at school, so I'm not very hot on the sort of technology and the clever stuff myself. But I've got into the habit of building infrastructures around business people to allow their businesses to grow, and so that was the side of the activity I concentrated on. And and over the last 3 or 4 years, we've hired a lot of people, a lot of clever engineers. We've raised some money for the business. We've developed some very interesting technology. We've had a sort of world first with our drone technology, which was sort of demonstrated in Cornwall at the beginning of the year, and we're sort of continuing on the journey to sort of build the business out. And the ultimate goal is to provide a really useful research and testing service for people in a whole variety of industries. We've identified 30 different industries that will likely want to use our services when the business gets into sort of full scale commercial production.
So can you tell me a little bit more about sort of what was that world first that you kind of just zoomed through it? The world first, we did a world first Cornwall, and it's not a big deal, but it sounds pretty interesting. Okay,
so within the space industry, which is enormous, there are various niches or specializations. I think investors don't like the word niche, but they quite like the word specialization, so let's call them specializations. And our specialization revolves around research and testing, and in particular what we want to enable people to do is to do more research and testing in microgravity. And microgravity is effectively a sort of a state of weightlessness. It's a bit like when you drive over a humpback bridge, you get that sort of weightless feeling in your stomach. And it's very difficult to create that environment on Earth. And so we've been developing different types of technology to allow us to create those environments. One of the things we've done is build an uncrewed aerial system, which or UAS, but most commonly known as a drone. And we launched this drone in Cornwall in partnership with some space industry people down there in January, and we managed to successfully create microgravity within a drop pod from a drone, and that's the first time that's ever been done in the world. And the really useful thing about that is it means that rather than people having to take any experiments they want to do to some specialist facility somewhere. There aren't any in the UK really, so you'd have to probably go to you'd have to go to Germany, or you'd have to go to America. We can actually take the sort of test environment to the client, as we'll be able to operate these drones from pretty much any airfield in the UK. So it's an exciting development, and it's an example of how new technology is really changing the face of research and testing.
And give a perspective on that. So what would that drone, how big is that drone in regards to that sort of testing, and what sort of tests would that drone take out? What sort of parameters would it be testing, if that makes sense?
Okay, so the drone, it's actually that the system is sort of two parts. So that there's a big drone which is about 2 meters across, which has got a number of blades, and it's typical, like most drones that you'll be familiar with, and that's what we call our ascent vehicle, and that lifts up a drop pod, and then the drop pod is about 1 meter long, and it's got some fans in it. And what happens is when the ascent vehicle gets to a certain height, it releases the drop pod, and the fans accelerate the drop pod towards Earth. And by accelerating it to Earth, we effectively take out the effect of gravity for anything that's inside the drop pod. And so we get a period, and it's only a few seconds, and depending on the altitude we go to, it'll be between 5 and 12 seconds of microgravity. Well, that's enough for scientists to understand the behavior of certain things within that microgravity environment. And I think in the US, most of the microgravity experimentation is probably to do with life sciences or agri-tech. It could be vaccine development. It could be trying to improve the protein value in foods, etc. In Europe, much more of the research is actually on material science. So it might be trying to make a stronger alloy or a sort of carbon-free building material. And it's really understanding how these chemical and physical reactions take place in an environment where gravity isn't interfering with it.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I suppose from the sort of space sector, what would you say? Because I think a lot of people still think it's quite far away until that sector's fully formed. Would you agree with that, or would you say you think we're a lot closer in regards to that sector developing? Because you've got the likes of, I suppose probably one of the most practical businesses that is in space at this moment in time, I probably would say is probably Starlink. That's with how they're changing fiber and how we connect our internet in remote locations and things like that. What do you think is probably the fastest thing that's on the horizon for booming in the space sector?
Well, I think actually that the space sector is all around us, and although we don't see it, we're actually using the space sector as part of the supply chain for just about everything we do on Earth today. So, you're sitting watching the football on Sky TV. That's being broadcast, via satellite. There's a huge, about 90% of climate data, is supposed to come from data that's collected and then served through space. We've got security issues or defense issues where people are watching out, to sort of protect the country. We've got farmers driving their combine harvesters based on sat-nav, and that data all comes from space. So there are very few industries actually that aren't touched by space at the moment. But you're right, I think Starlink is a really good example of something that's very of the moment. And there are a number of companies that are trying to build up these constellations of satellites in order predominantly to provide broadcast and communication services, but there's a whole range of other activity that can take place. And the area that I suppose we probably see the most growth in is relates to climate science, that much more data is being collected on the climate. Even when companies are trying to monitor their carbon footprint now, they're looking at the carbon emissions from their buildings, and that data is being collected in space. So more Earth observation equipment is being deployed. But the challenge for a lot of these businesses is that when you put something in space, it doesn't always work, and there are certain classes of these very small satellites where actually the failure rate is as high as 50%, and that's a big problem on a lot of levels. But the biggest challenge for these companies is that they can't, once they've deployed it in space, they can't get it back to see what's gone wrong with it. So one of the apart from the scientific research services that we offer at Gravity Lab, the other half of our business really is around providing testing and qualification services. So people can they can put a payload onto not so much our drone, but more onto our rocket that we're developing, and then they can put that into space for a short period of time, and then it comes straight back down to Earth, and then we recover the payload. We collect data all through the flight, but afterwards our customers can take a look at the payload. They can see what's working. If it's not working, they can see at what point it stopped working, etc. So that testing facility is something that's really important.
And I suppose out of interest, are you actually seeing, obviously I don't want me to pry too much, are you seeing sort of like a large gaming clients that are interested in this sort of testing? Is it early days for that side of things? Or is it well developed and there's a lot of customers sort of queuing up to test?
Well, it's a mixture of both. I think in terms of the research activity, that's a well-trodden path, and people have been trying to research in microgravity for many years. But there are limited ways you can do it. You can drop things in a very tall building called a drop tower, which has got a vacuum in it, or you can put things onto an old-fashioned sort of slightly larger rocket, which doesn't actually make it quite into space. But they're capable of creating microgravity environments, but typically those are only available to sort of academic / institutional clients. There's typically a 2-year waiting list. It's very expensive, and actually only about 40% of the people that want to do that research can get onto those programs. That's probably about a $1.5 billion market, worldwide for that type of activity already. So our perspective is that we can disrupt that by making services much more available, much more quickly, and not only make it available to sort of institutional clients, but make it available to private enterprise as well, which hasn't had that benefit before.
Okay, sounds really interesting. In regards to can you elaborate a little bit more about this rocket that you're working on as a project and what that sort of entails?
Yeah, we've got a rocket called Isaac, and we name all of our products after we take the first name of famous scientists. So we've got Isaac and Louis and Walter and Frank and Annie and Edith. So there's a whole range of different things that we're producing. But the rocket, which will hopefully do the sort of main close to final testing at the end of this year, and will go into sort of commercial service next year. That will take payloads up to around 200 kilometers, which is not quite as high as where the space station is orbiting, but then bring it straight back down. So the rockets sort of go up on what we call a parabolic arc. And during the top of the flight, when they reach the apogee, again, it's going back to the humpback bridge analogy, as it sort of goes over the top of its apogee, that's the period of weightlessness, which our customers want to test and research in. But actually, the next development of the rocket will actually allow them to expose their payloads to a space environment as well. So we've got a retractable payload bay, which is again something that's unique. So we've got a patent on the drone system already, but we're now applying for a patent on the payload system, which is interesting. But so one thing you asked earlier on about whether we've got more customers that are coming to the market, that is definitely the case. And the more people understand that these environments are now accessible to them, the more that are coming along. So although we haven't launched our service yet, we've got 30 odd customers already sort of ready to sort of work with us, on these things. So I'm hopeful that when we start our marketing, that actually, we'll end up with a lot more than that.
It sounds really interesting. So from my point of view, I know nothing about SpaceX. I suppose, like you said, the only practicalities that I know of is, like you're saying about Sky and the satellite and the communication side. Starlink, I think, has been quite exciting. I think from my perspective, I'm actually a Starlink user myself, so I can sort of relate to it. And it's like, I have no downtime whatsoever. If a satellite was able to disconnect, my satellite just goes like this, and then just moves to the next one, and then connects to that. And I still find that quite fascinating that it can do that. But also, I think some of the stats behind that in regards to space and its growth was, I believe it's one of the fastest growing Wi-Fi providers in the whole of America, because obviously they don't have to dig up the roads to put in fiber or anything like that. It's literally, you put it on your roof, you can actually assemble it yourself, which is crazy to think, and it automatically connects. I see that expanding, very, very quickly. And almost it's a bit strange because you kind of go past sort of governmental control. I've seen China saying stuff that we don't want any of your satellites going anywhere over China or offering your services and things like that. It sort of takes the power away from those, I suppose, those tight-knit government organizations, I should say, especially China. But do you see any sort of far-fetched sort of sectors growing? Because I've heard all sorts. I mean, what's your opinion on you're probably going to laugh at me at this point of view because I probably sound like a novice, but I've heard of asteroid mining as in an actual thing in the near future because of the resources and the natural resources that are on asteroids. Obviously, I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm going a bit off topic, but what's your actual thoughts about that?
Well, I think that the fact is that the technology now exists to put things into space and beyond the sort of near space of the orbit of Earth. And asteroids are considered to have huge amounts of mineral wealth within them. So I think that sort of thing is all possible, but I wouldn't say that it's imminent. That there's quite a lot of talk at the moment about actually manufacturing things in space, and there's a British company called Space Forge, which is developing a sort of little factory almost to sort of build things in space. And they're hoping to have that sort of commercially available before the end of the decade. But I suppose that our perspective would be that really before you do any of those things, you want to test what you're going to do. So we're hoping that we'd be at the sort of front end of the supply chain by providing those testing facilities. What a good example actually is that, on an asteroid, or if you want to go mining on Mars, actually the gravitational environment on Mars is very different from the one here. So if you're using a drill or a pump or something like that, how does the fact that the gravitational environment on Mars is different? With our drone service, you'll actually be able to test things in an altered gravity environment. It doesn't have to be zero gravity. It could just be sort of partial gravity. And that's another thing that should make a really big difference, not just from a science point of view, but also from a development point of view for people developing tools and equipment that are going to be used in space.
Yeah, I suppose it's a really interesting side of it because the way that I can relate to what you're doing for the testing phase is I was at McLaren Technology World, and when they've got their cars actually physically going around the track, they've got a whole room of people analysing the burn rate of the tyres, the wind, the heat, everything like that. And if they think there's a valid change that would make a difference on track, they then get the simulation driver there at McLaren Technology World to adjust the exact same real environment settings straight onto the car to see if it makes an improvement. And then if it does, they pull off the driver to make the adjusted changes to the vehicle. And I suppose it's the same sort of thing that you're doing, but in space. You're basically saying, let's see if we can make this more efficient and test its capabilities to make sure everything's right before you get to that stage, so it makes sense to be there, and you're going to be right at the front of that supply chain that's to come. I suppose on the point you mentioned there about putting almost like a factory up there, what would be the benefits for that business to go and do that?
Well, so that I think people underestimate the effects of gravity on Earth. I mean, yes, it means that we all stay connected to the planet, but actually it's very disruptive, and it's a bit like I liken it to the old days of the old radio signals when you used to get a lot of interference, and now you've got a digital signal, so all that interference is filtered out. But basically, anything that happens on Earth is affected by gravity. So one good example would be if you're trying to grow a crystal. As the crystal grows, gravity always pulls the crystal down, towards the Earth. So you don't get a pure crystal growth. There are always going to be some flaws in those crystals. Where if it grows where there's no gravity, then it grows in 3 dimensions, pure and evenly. An example, a practical example of that is in the semiconductor industry. If you're trying to grow a silicon crystal, we've probably reached just about the limit of how pure a silicon crystal we can make while gravity is acting on it as it's growing. And if we had a completely pure silicon crystal, would that allow us to have faster semiconductors? Would it allow us to have more efficient solar panels? And these are the sort of things that material scientists are trying to work through.
Oh, that's exciting. That puts it in a completely different context, doesn't it? You don't really think about that, I suppose.
And then on the food thing we mentioned earlier on, it's the shelf life of food. Actually, if you have a different sort of proteins within food or within grains, could you extend the shelf life of bread by a couple of days? What impact would that have on food waste? What practically would it have on the price of the loaf of bread that you're buying? So there are lots of different ways that things come. So that's probably less of an example. The bread example is less of a manufacturing example, but it's an example of how understanding how things work where there's no gravity around makes a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. I suppose they're doing a lot of those tests, aren't they? You see them when they go on the International Space Station. They're doing a lot of tests up there. Would you say that that's predominantly where a lot of these sort of in the live environment case studies are taking place at this moment?
Well, the majority probably happen either on the rockets that NASA use, or on the drop towers, or the other thing you can do is you can actually hire an airplane and get it to fly in consecutive sort of, not quite loop the loop, but it goes up in a big parabola and then sort of dives down the other side. Yeah. They're collectively known as the vomit comets. But there is a period several periods during the course of each of those flights when there's no gravity, and so you can do some tests there. So the space station, yes, there are experiments that happen on the space station, but it's super expensive, to get there. There's a huge lead time before you can get anything up there. Then your experiment is stuck up there for 6 months as well. So it's not. So yes, that absolutely there are some experiments happening there, and it's a really important environment to do those things in, but it's probably not the most commonly used one.
I'm surprised Elon Musk hasn't tried to challenge sort of the space station and launch his own one.
Well, I think almost certainly that's part of the plan, really, and the fact that he's got reusable rockets, so he can take things up to space and then stay up there for a period of time and then come back down again. I'm sure that will happen. And I think that Blue Origin, they've actually looking at ways that they can utilize their spacecraft to provide some sort of scientific services as well, particularly as it sort of passes through the upper atmosphere. So I don't think we're not exactly alone in what we're doing, but where we are different is by using what we call suborbital rocket technology. So our rockets are never intended to go into orbit. They're just intended to sort of go up for a period of time and then come back down again. And that means that the cost of developing one of our rockets is probably less than 1% of developing an orbital rocket. So again, it comes back to my argument I made earlier on about investing in a service industry, because like any service, you're going to have some technology at your disposal. We just happen to have some very specialist technology. But the overall cost of developing our technology it's not trivial, but it's very small compared with the big players that are trying to compete in the orbital marketplace.
What's your thought on the? I've still, do you know what? I can't remember the company. I joined the wait list because I thought it was amazing, and I don't. I think I'm like 10,000 in queue at the moment. It's a capsule with a big balloon on the top, and it brings you up into. I don't know if it's in space or the very borders of space, and then it literally comes back down afterwards, and it's about like an hour trip. What's your sort of opinions on that? Could that be used for testings and in that regards or not?
There are companies that that offer that, and yes, you can go to a great height, but you can't really get close to space. I mean, generally the people consider the space to be defined by something called the Kármán line, which is around 100 kilometers, up from the Earth's surface, and the balloons can't get to anything like that height. But in fact, some of the tourist flights that have happened recently, they actually didn't get beyond 100 kilometers, so they weren't really in space.
Okay.
Although they were probably high enough up, to feel like it. So you could do things in the balloons. You wouldn't be able to provide a microgravity environment, there, but you could provide a very thin air environment, and you can certainly do scientific testing on the gases in the upper atmosphere things. I think generally speaking, the space tourism is a different sort of market from the one we're in, and I'm sure there will be lots of people, very wealthy people, that will want to go into space, and there'll be different ways of doing it, and there'll be different extremes, and you can go to a great height which is not in space, but it would feel like it, and that may be fantastic, and balloons may be able to deliver that. But to really get out of the atmosphere, you would need to be in a rocket, and traveling at great speed. So that's a sort of slightly different angle. So I'm not sure. In fact, we've got a customer on our books that it offers a balloon related service, and they want to test some components with us, before they go into sort of commercial production. So that not saying it's not a thing. It's probably just not as big an opportunity as some of the other areas in the space industry.
I remember watching the presentation from Elon on being able to go from London to Australia, and I think it was like I think if I remember right, it was like 30 minutes, maybe even less than that, going out and then across and back down. Do you think that's realistic? Do you think we're far away from seeing that actually take place?
I think space. There's an expression that space is hard or space is difficult, and that there are a lot of challenges with getting things off of the Earth because gravity is so strong. We have an unusually strong gravitational pull as a planet. We've got a very dense planet, so things really need to be optimized, and it's so yes, I'm sure you could get an airplane to go to a great height, and you could travel through the stratosphere, and you could land relatively quickly, on the other side of the Earth. So I'm sure that would be possible, but I was reading something the other day, and I think it is possible, but it's unlikely to happen in the next 20 years. So I think there's probably a much longer development program for something like that, because the intricacies of making it happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. Okay.
But it's to do with sort of propulsion systems and things like that. So we've been developing our propulsion system for a while at Gravity Lab, which is very exciting, and it produces more thrust, more energy than other systems have done in the past. It's actually an incredibly simple system, and we have effectively a large candle which is made out of paraffin wax, and then we flood it with nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas effectively. So two pretty inert things, but when they're combined and set on fire, they burn very voraciously. So I think you've probably seen Mad Max where they say hit the nitro. Well, that's flooding something that's already burning with nitrous oxide, so to really give it the extra impetus. So that's effectively how our propulsion system works. and we go through the process of optimizing that for getting the rocket from where it starts up into the level of space we want to, and then come back down again. But actually, that again, the paraffin wax is much better than anything else that's been used before. But we're now working on a new rocket fuel, which is actually based on beeswax.
Really?
So, I thought, wow, that sounds ridiculous. But if you think back, before we made candles out of paraffin wax, they were made out of beeswax. So the chemical is not completely different. And the analysis we've done so far suggests actually the chemical composition of beeswax is better than paraffin wax in terms of creating the energy that we're trying to create in order to get the rocket to lift off and fly at about 6 times the speed of sound. So it's very, it's an exciting development, but also it would be very good from a sustainability point of view, because we'd effectively get down to sort of no carbon emissions if we use beeswax.
Yeah, I was about to say you tick the box there. That's a lot of people would probably like getting, because you saw after all of the when Jeff Bezos went and done his space one, Richard Branson did theirs, and there was like a few days apart. All the news was flooded the next day. Was this necessary for our atmosphere? What, all the damage it was doing, and so on and so forth. So I suppose if you do go down the route of beeswax, it'd be pretty impressive to combat.
It would certainly help, and that's part of the problem with the older rocket technology is they burn these fuels and they leave lots of heavy metal particulates in the air and things. They also burn for a long time, and again, some of the vomit comets we talked about earlier on. I mean, you're taking a great big airplane and you're flying it for an extended period of time. But our rockets, that probably will burn for, the engines will burn for actually less than a minute, but we'll still manage to get 200 kilometers. So it's it really is a different type of technology, and so even with paraffin wax, there's not a lot of emissions from the paraffin wax. It's probably 75% less than other launches that other people are doing at the moment.
Did you think other people out there like Elon Musk, like Jeff, like Richard, they're looking at stuff like beeswax? I know it sounds like
I don't think, I think because of the way things need to be optimized, so we're looking at it because it can provide a really vigorous short burn, which is what we need. As I said, we're going to be getting up to perhaps 6 times the speed of sound, very, very quickly. And then the momentum of the rocket then sort of carries it on through through the rest of its flight. But I'm not sure that it would work. For what they're doing, they need to have more control over the rocket during its flight. And they'll have different stages and different engines that will have to burn in succession. We can have some control over ours, but really we've just got the gas and we've got the candle, and we're flooding one past the other. And as I said, it only burns for a relatively short period of time. So it's a different type of technology from the one that they're using.
Yeah, no, definitely. I suppose from all of your experience through working on this, what's it that you're most excited about the sector?
I think that the first thing is that it's possible to build an amazing business where the market for us could be £2 billion, £3 billion, relatively easy. That there is not really anybody else that's doing what we're doing. There's one American company that is trying to build some suborbital rockets that are likely to be used for sort of research and testing purposes. But there's not really anyone else that's building the same sort of rockets as we are. The technology we've got is great, from the drone to the retractable payload system, and I ended up hiring some absolutely fantastic people from all around the world. We've got, I think we've got among the 20 odd people, we've got something like 8 different nationalities, who've come on board, and that they're all super clever with big wobbly brains and masters in astrophysics and all sorts of other things that I certainly don't understand. Yeah. But just seeing them all working together and doing their thing, it's really exciting. And ultimately we're going to be building a business, and I suppose that's the difference from my days in the investment world. In the investment world, early on, I was, you're trading the markets, you're buying and selling things, and it's about the supply and demand of the shares. But you could get a thing where a company comes up with great results and then the share price goes down because actually everybody owns it already. Whereas in the venture capital world, if you have some success, that adds tangible value to the company each time. And the more success that you have, the more customers, the more sales, that the more the company increases in value, because they're really valued on their fundamental worth rather than the supply and demand factor within a marketplace.
Sounds very, very interesting. Okay. So I suppose when you say that, the most part you're interested in Gravity Labs. That's the most exciting part of the space sector to go forward. So sort of like the testing phase of everything prior to going to space makes sense. And it sounds like an interesting avenue for the traders, investors that are listening. How's the best way at this moment in time to look to invest into space?
Well, I think there are lots of large listed companies that have got a big aerospace heritage. Companies like BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, this company in Canada called Magellan Aerospace. So those are opportunities. There are some more specialist businesses like Virgin Galactic, or there's a New Zealand business called Rocket Lab that's done well over the years. There are a few funds, I think in the UK, that the Seraphim runs a space fund that people can invest in. But most the people that I know, most of the businesses at the sort of early stage, if you like, of their growth, are actually privately funded. And so at Gravity Lab, we're funded pretty much exclusively by private individuals, some family offices. And we've got one small fund, which is an EIS investment fund called the British Design Fund that invested some money last year. But it's and the private individuals, they're not really space experts. They're investment experts that they come from all different walks of life and different backgrounds, and they're just I think they're curious about space, but they recognise that. It's a different type of service business, but if we get it right, and it's obviously always a big if, but if one does get it right, then the returns could be pretty attractive. So
okay, so can people listening to this actually go and invest into Gravity Labs?
Yeah, they could. We're covered by something called the Enterprise Investment Scheme, which is or EIS, which gives private investors, some tax relief on their investments, and that's one of the things. So we raised about £2 million last year, and we're hoping to raise about £5 million this year, which should be sort of under that scheme as well. And that really sits alongside our other funding sources. We're also getting some grants. We just won a £400,000 grant from the UK Space Agency, and we're working on some other grant applications at the moment. So that they have a sort of blended capital structure, if you like. We also might take on a little bit of debt to mix it all together. But we're just at that sort of rather exciting inflection point, having been a sort of bootstrap startup for 3 or 4 years, getting our sort of technology together. We're now getting to the point where we're signing up customers, and we're about to turn into this sort of independent commercial entity. And we need a bit more money, to get us over the line and get us to that point. But it's really exciting.
Yeah. So for anybody listening, how do they find out about that, or where could they go to explore that further?
That now you've thrown me slightly. I think the best thing to do would be to look at the Gravity Lab website. So you've got www.gravitylab.space is the website, and there's some contact details on there. Or they could look me up, James Kilpatrick, on LinkedIn, and very happy to take any interest through that. So they should be able to find me there. We've got lots of sort of documentation that we can send out and tell people what we're doing. but
Definitely
yeah,
might be worth after this podcast, maybe putting a link together, because otherwise you're going to get spammed by hundreds of people asking what's the best way to do this, and they won't know what hit them. But it's definitely, maybe we'll for everyone listening, maybe on the podcast we'll put a link together or something that's got a bit of a documentation of more information if people want to explore it in that sense a little bit further.
Okay, we'll do that. Yes. Okay.
That definitely makes sense. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you'll be going, I've got hundreds of requests on LinkedIn, and Gravity Labs contact page is getting absolutely blasted by people. But hey, it's been amazing having you. Is there anything else that you would like to add for the podcast? I think it's been a fantastic sort of learning curve around investing in space, that's for sure.
No, I mean, I think your podcast series is brilliant, and I think familiarizing people with the different opportunities that are out there is great. I've been involved with the public markets, and it's a really exciting environment. And I've been involved with private companies. I suppose that at heart, I'm a businessman, and I enjoy running the small companies, and that they've proved successful. That's been great. But I'm not really in a position to advise anyone on what they want to do, but hopefully I'm in a position to sort of facilitate things if people want to help. But no, investment is it's a bit of an addiction, I suppose. People just it's sort of in their blood, and people that like doing fantasy football league, they should like doing investment. It's the same sort of process. You've got there's a whole world of opportunities out there that you can choose from, and trying to pick the right ones at the right time, and and create some value out of that process. I think it's a most enjoyable way to spend your time, and if you can make some money out of it as well, then all the better.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on the podcast, James. Really appreciate your time, and look forward to hearing more about the future of Gravity Labs and how it develops over time.
Well, brilliant, Sam. You've been a great host, so thank you very much indeed for having me.
So that's James Kilpatrick from Gravity Labs. Super excited about how to invest in space. Some of the crazy things that's going on in space as well with, I was talking about the whole asteroids mining side of things there. The testing side before it gets into space sounds super interesting as well. Obviously, I don't know, but what you guys and the listeners are thinking about, but don't forget, it was only in the news, literally, from the Pentagon putting out there that they believe that an alien mothership could be in space. I'm not joking. Go Google it on the news. It was actually a thing. But guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Be sure to give us some feedback, and thanks for listening to Wise Wealth. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.